about the adventures of two boys back in Illinois many, many years ago. It was involved myself and my brother Richard Fry at the time. In the 1920s, after World War I, there were many surplus aircraft available to be purchased from the government at very low prices. Among the most available and most prized were the two cockpit training biplanes that were used at the many Army Air Corps fields around the country to teach budding pilots how to fly. The availability of these war surplus biplanes and trained pilots spawned a new industry called, quote, barnstorming, consisting of ex-Army pilots who bought themselves one of these surplus planes and toured the country, stopping at county fairs or even at farmers with a level grass pasture where they could land and take off and sell rides to the local people from the neighboring cities. The summer I turned 11 years old in 1928, one of these barnstorming pilots came to my hometown of Danville, Illinois, and set up shop in a farm pasture about 5 miles north of town, beside the two-lane mainline highway to Chicago, and proceeded to sell plane rides, of course, during daylight hours only in those days. By some fortuitous chance, which I've never fully understood, my father was persuaded to allow his older sons, myself, the oldest, and my brother, Richard, 2.5 years younger than I, and thus 8.5 years old, to have a ride in the plane, in the barnstorming plane. My father had absolutely no desire to fly himself, and it would have been unheard of for my mother to fly. At any rate, my brother and I found ourselves one Saturday morning being driven out to the informal grassy, quote, airfield by one of the employees of my father. When we arrived at the airfield, no airplane was visible, being out on a flight with passenger. But soon it came back, flying low over the farmland, and landed gracefully on the grassy pasture land. It taxied slowly to where we were waiting, stopping with the engine idling and the propeller slowly turning. The pilot in the back opened the cockpit, pushed his goggles up on his helmet, climbed out, helped his passenger in the front cockpit, unbuckle his seat belt, helped him climb out and jump down to the ground. Then it was our turn. The pilot helped us climb up on the lower wing and into the front cockpit, my brother first and then I. We were both jammed into the limited space, side by side, and the single seat belt fastened across our bodies. We had no helmets or goggles, but were told that the plastic windscreen on the front rim of the cockpit would help protect us from the wind. We were also warned not to touch any of the controls and instruments in front of us. Fortunately, the joystick had been removed from the front passenger cockpit, but the rudder control pedals were still attached to the floor. Then we were all snugly tucked in and ready to go. The pilot climbed into the rear cockpit, fastened his seat belt, revved up the engine, and we slowly taxied down the grassy runway to the far end of the pasture. The plane turned around, and with the roar of the engine We began the takeoff with the wind from the propeller blowing in our faces. As the speed increased, the ride became increasingly bumpy. Suddenly, we were airborne. The bumping ceased, and we rose peacefully and smoothly into the air. I was, of course, thrilled and excited, but my younger brother, Richard, was terrorized. He later told me that he kept his eyes tightly shut for most of the flight, being frightened by noise of the engine and the wind. The flight was rather short, only about 15 minutes. We circled around the local countryside at low altitude. From the air, the terrain looked completely different from what I had expected, a situation that still occurs today whenever I look out of the plane window when approaching a landing. Our airplane ride of more than 80 years ago was over too soon as we glided into land with a bump on the grassy pasture in eastern Illinois, and I completed our first airplane ride. I've had many airplane rides since then, but this was the most exciting I'd ever had. That's it. Thank you.